Redirect?
Yes, please.
And you're still under oath, Dr. Anderson?
Doctor, you were asked on direct about whether or not, you were asked on cross.
Thank you.
You were asked on cross about whether or not you had read Dr. France's report. You remember that colloquy?
I remember the question.
Right. And part of your answer to that I want to follow up on is you said that you did not read that report before your analysis of these remains, correct?
That's correct.
Why wouldn't you want to read another forensic anthropologist's analysis before you conducted your own?
Why don't you try to avoid or minimize bias? Once the defense counsel advised me that I could examine the recovered remains myself up here in Colorado, I didn't care what another anthropologist or pathologist said. I wanted to approach that as this is a case that I'm asked to look at and opine on everything I can. So that's why.
And why is it important? I mean, explain to the jury how reading another forensic anthropologist's report or analysis could affect someone in theirs.
If you think one of your colleagues found something, you're going to look for that. If you don't know what they found, you're going to look at everything, and then any little thing becomes more important.
And why is it important to keep bias out of a scientific analysis like the one that you conducted in this case?
Yeah, bias is terribly, avoidance or minimization of bias in science is extremely important. If my role here, if the role of forensic science in a court of law is to try to help the juror understand things, then we want to keep bias at a minimum. And if I looked at another anthropologist's report, then I'm biased. I cannot ever get that out of my head. And whatever findings I have, I don't know if I would have made that same finding had I not read what a colleague said.
So if one forensic anthropologist's report was presented to another one, based upon your expertise and experience, you would expect that second anthropologist to be affected by that report they read before they do their analysis.
I don't know how you couldn't.
Another discussion that occurred during cross was the level of magnification you used when you looked at the cranium. Remember talking about that?
I do.
And understanding you viewed the cranium a while ago, you understand you used what's called an 8-power magnifying glass. Is that correct?
That's what I used.
And did you have enough magnification of the cranium to offer your opinions and analysis of this cranium?
I think 8-power was enough for me to recognize naturally occurring sulci and that zygomatic root. It certainly was enough for me to see a white globule that was put in there by somebody else. And I could see the little uplift of bone. So I think for those items, 8-power was enough.
And if you didn't have enough magnification, would you have said so and said, I can't do this analysis, I need a bigger machine or something like that?
Well, I brought a light source, a camera, and that magnifying loupe with me because my 66-year-old, then 64-year-old eyes, I wasn't going to trust it to my eyesight. So I brought the tools, the instruments I thought would be necessary for me to render an opinion.
And do you know what a scanning electron microscope is?
Yes.
And in your opinion, would a scanning electron microscope provide the most detail in looking at this cranium?
It would provide much more than I could provide with an 8-power loupe. And my dissection scope back in Tucson, I believe, is 40 to 100 power. That would be enough for me to make a more definitive statement that a scanning electron microscope could actually show these gouges and demonstrate whether or not they're naturally occurring sulci or they're produced by something else.
And to your knowledge, has any forensic anthropologist in this case utilized a scanning electron microscope to look at these defects?
No, I haven't. And when I asked defense counsel repeatedly if it had been done, I believe your response was no.
And talked about some photographs you took when you looked at the cranium. Remember that?
I do.
And again, explain to the jury why you took pictures of the packaging and the cranium, what your purpose was in that.
For chain of custody, it's a term we use to kind of document when one person or one entity receives evidence or remains from another. So with these 8 or 10 photographs I think I took, I could then later, today in a court of law, say these photographs show that the box I opened with the label on the box with the partial skeletal remains inside, these are the same remains that were recovered and then autopsied by authorities and looked at by the other forensic anthropologists.
And were these photos part of a documentation, record-keeping thing on your part, or did they play a part in your forensic analysis?
No, the camera didn't have enough power, nor did I have enough light with me to magnify some of these features. So they were strictly for chain of custody documentation.
A lot of discussion during cross occurred about your description of the zygomatic root. Remember talking about that for a while?
I do.
And there'll be a follow-up question to this, but explain to the jury again what your observation was of the sulci and the raking and all that.
There are multiple naturally occurring depressions in the bone that are caused by bone growing faster than neurovascular bundles can stretch. One of these, I believe, sulci, even though it was partially occluded by this white globule that was placed there by somebody else, showed a little bit of uplift to the margin. So instead of a U-shaped sulcus, think of an omega-shaped sulcus. It had just a little bit of a roof growing over it. The only way, to my mind, you could produce that is if something went in that shallow sulcus, and lifted that piece of bone up.
And there was some discussion about how, in your opinion, that could be a tooth or something raking through that sulcus, correct?
I think an incisor tooth or even a claw to produce that.
Now, explain why that sort of tooth or claw damage might be on the superior parts of the zygomatic arch, but there might not be an accompanying tooth mark or rake mark or claw mark on the other side of that.
If it is what I postulate, it wasn't a clamping down of the upper and lower jaw by the critter. It was just probably the upper teeth, could be the lower teeth. It's just one set of teeth scraping down. Do you remember when I made the analogy about trying to pick up a cue ball with your fingernails, and you probably can't do that? I certainly can't pick up a plastic cranium with my fingernails. So all those scratches to the top of this young man's skull are just that. They're attempts at either teeth or claws trying to grab something. So partly because of the broken zygomatic arch just in the photograph, if you remember, just to the right of this sulcus, we know an animal has a mouth there. We know an animal had its mouth in that area.
Permission to approach.
Yes.
Probably need new batteries. Here, hand it to me.
Can I continue questions? Could you demonstrate to the jury on that model how that tooth damage could happen to the zygomatic arch, zygomatic root, without leaving other teeth mark on the cranium?
If you recall, this part of the cranium and the face were missing. They never recovered. Ostensibly, they're chewed away by an animal. You also recall from photographs, the outer table of the temporal mastoid process here was missing. It had been broken away, and the internal air cells are visible. So if you can imagine an animal in the process of breaking away, which we know happened, breaking away the bottom part of the basic cranium, taking a tooth like that at the root of the zygomatic arch, that would be one way an animal who's trying to clamp down, and perhaps did clamp down in a mastoid air cell, did clamp down on a piece of bone we don't have anymore, breaking probably an upper tooth, an upper incisor along this ledge.
And now that I don't need it anymore, I'm going to go take this microphone and put it back. But some discussion was had during cross-examination about perimortem, and I want to follow up on that. Based upon your expertise, papers you published regarding taphonomy, being a forensic anthropologist, you would agree that perimortem is defined by the amount of moisture, collagen in the bone. Is that correct?
That's not exactly correct. The retention of elastic properties, and that's, as I explained earlier, bone being both calcium, salts, and minerals, and collagen, a protein that gives bone some resiliency. Moisture helps retain, even though the person's dead, not all the bone cells may be dead. And some of the collagen, because it's a strand of protein, may still be partially functional. So what moisture, retention of moisture does in a dead body is allow bone to break the same way it would as if you were alive.
And there was also some discussion during cross-examination about the kind of damage birds can do to skeletal remains. Explain that to the jury.
Well, Arizona vultures will find a body, and many times we have not only vulture feathers, but a whole bunch of defecation all over the place. But they attack joints. They have beaks, right? Everybody on the same page, right? The birds have a big beak. So they can't do the kind of gnawing that canids do. But they go for the eyes, and they peck out a signature of vulture feeding, which we don't see with coyotes, is the pecking out of a very thin bone inside the orbit, both sides. And then they go to the joints, and they start working their way in through the skin, and they put their head completely inside the skin and start pulling tendon and muscle out. And they will erode, or what's the word for not chew? I guess birds chew, but their beaks will produce these gouges and things that look nothing like coyotes. Another thing they do, or at least we're told that maybe the dominant male or female does, is they get up on the rib cage, and they tear through the abdomen. So all the viscera is gone, the skin is being eaten, the muscles are being pulled out through these holes in the skin, the face is being pecked at. But they get up on the rib cage and they start posturing, and that breaks ribs further back here than we see when coyotes get in here and they start eating away not only the skin and the viscera, but then the bones itself. So in Arizona, it's pretty clear when you have vulture or coyote, or vulture and coyote.
And one of the statements attributed to you by counsel when you did your interview, your phone interview with the prosecutors in 2019, is that you said, they claim, that birds do not leave evidence of scavenging. Remember talking about that?
I don't remember the conversation, but the only thing that makes sense to me is I would have said birds do not leave the same kind of evidence of scavenging as canids do.
You recall saying to them, birds might not leave evidence of scavenging on the bone.
Well, coyotes might not leave evidence of scavenging on bones if all they ate were the viscera, which you're going to start with, and then they got scared off by something. So I think it's possible that either one of those critters could start to eat a body and not affect bone. The longer they're there, each one, the more likely they're going to affect the bone, alter the bone.
And that was a concept that came up during cross-examination too. And I'd ask you to explain that to the jury. The amount of time that a body is left out in nature in the wilderness before discovery, how does that affect the amount of the volume of remains that get found?
The longer a person lays out in the wilderness, the soft parts are going to be taken away within days or weeks, and then the bony parts, at least a portion of the skeleton, it's going to be taken away. And the longer a body and then skeletalized remains without any flesh lay out there, the more likely the same critters that did that are going to come back and take more, or different critters are going to find that body and feed off of it.
And would you agree that as time goes on, the more a body is going to become disarticulated, taken apart, missing limbs, missing cranium?
That's true, and especially in a more moist environment like southern Colorado, where insects are active all year round. You don't need the coyotes to disarticulate a body. The microbes in our bodies and the insects, the fly larvae, and then the domestic beetles, they can disarticulate all 206 bones in the human body left to their own devices. So you don't even need the animal scavengers to do that.
And do you recall telling the prosecutors in 2019 about this concept, that the longer a body is out, the more damage it's going to sustain?
If they asked me, I would have given a very similar response.
There was some discussion about Hagelin's book, and you wrote a chapter in that book, correct?
Right.
So explain to the jury who Hagelin is, please.
Bill Hagelin, I think he's still alive. I hope he's still alive. He was the Seattle forensic anthropologist in the 80s and 90s when I was being trained in the early 80s. When I met Dr. Hagelin in Seattle in the mid-80s. He was involved with those notorious Green River killings. So there were a whole lot of young women whose bodies were dumped in the woods in and around Seattle. So much like we have in southern Arizona, we have this unexpected high number of bodies that are decomposing outside. Dr. Hagelin got that in the Seattle area, and he was wise enough to publish his findings and get other people who were working in the field to also publish their findings. So I think the book is called Forensic Taphonomy. I think it might be the first book that has that title. It's now in at least the second edition with additional chapters and it's been updated, but it's a book that a lot of us use. And most forensic anthropologists, if they're not familiar with it, they should be.
And the learned Dr. Hagelin asked you to contribute to that book based upon your expertise. Is that right?
Yes.
And it's your understanding of his chapter, and when's the last time you looked at that book or the chapter in that book, if you know?
I looked at the second edition when it came out, but it's probably a decade ago. I read the first edition cover to cover, but I don't routinely refer to those books like that unless there's a specific thing that I encountered during my examination. I may not remember the detail, but I remember I read something about that. So then I go and try to find that detail, that description that might address that detail in a book.
And it's your understanding, your recollection, that his findings about what gets found, how much gets found, flow from data that he was reviewing in Seattle in the Pacific Northwest in the 80s and 90s.
He knew it, and he knew it partially because in Knoxville, Tennessee, where the first forensic research facility and the first body decomposition facility was started in the early 80s. People, and they're still doing wonderful work in Knoxville, Tennessee, on rates of decomposition, taking pictures of decomposing humans every day, sometimes twice a day, as long as it takes until they're skeletonized. People by the late 80s were reading that and thinking, wow, that's really important work, but it doesn't hold in Arizona. And Dr. Hagelin probably knew it doesn't hold in Seattle because the amount of rainfall, the altitude, the elevation, the temperatures are all different.
And during cross-examination, you got asked extensively about what you do in the Sonoran Desert and how the Sonoran Desert ain't the San Juan Mountains. Remember talking about that?
Yes.
And have you done field work in southwestern Colorado around the Lake City region?
I have.
And can you explain to the jury what that region was, what the project was, what you did, what you saw in that environment?
Well, 32 years ago, I spent 2 weeks in Lake City with a team that was exhuming the 5 prospects that were murdered and then cannibalized by Alfred Packer. If you're a Colorado resident, you probably know the story. We exhumed those 5 men, all of whom had sharp force chop type, hatchet probably, injuries to their head. That would explain the cause of that. And virtually every long bone, every limb bone in the on these 5 prospectors had transverse cut marks strategically where muscles could be removed. And there were hundreds and hundreds of these transverse cut marks. We learned that when we took these skeletons back to Tucson and spent 2 or 3 weeks analyzing them in Tucson, and we brought them back up to Lake City for reburial. But part of what we were doing in enumerating, photographing, and measuring and listing all the cut marks is to look at what we thought was coyote action. 1870s coyotes, but these prospectors were killed in the dead of winter, bodies probably frozen, covered with snow, and they were found just a few months after Alfred Packer walked out of the mountains and told his story. But when they were found, they were scattered. They weren't all laying next to each other like you might expect in a campsite where 6 prospectors are huddled down trying to live through the winter. They were scattered all over the place. Some of the remains were missing. Some of the remains had gnaw marks on them. We assumed these were Colorado coyotes. So part of what we did is say that these are all righteous. Some of these cut marks, which were righteous cut marks from one of the knives that Alfred Packer had. Some were cut marks, but these other things were probably related to coyote feeding.
Another thing that came up on Cross was one of your proteges research, Maximilian Cantu. Remember talking about that?
Max Cantu, yeah, he was an intern of ours and did some pretty good research.
And it sounds like you were even in a supervisory capacity at University of Arizona regarding.
Well, the internship is through the University of Arizona Department of Anthropology. So Max worked with us probably for a semester, learning what forensic anthropologists do in Tucson. And then either during that time or after that time, I believe he wanted to write his master's thesis on the topic of what body parts are frequently missing and what body parts are frequently found when people die outside in the Sonoran Desert.
And you were informed during cross-examination that Master Cantu's findings in his report that spanned from 2010 to 2014 claimed that the cranium was found 80% of the time. Remember having that conversation?
I think that's what I heard, 80%. Yeah.
And
Your Honor,
Yes.
I'm sorry, objection. Mischaracterizing the evidence, it was 88% of the time,
I heard 80.
And I heard more than that, so.
and the study was years outside of the range the counsel just stated. It included some years within, but it was a wider range.
All right, that objection's noted, you can answer the question.
In trying to address that question, you wanted to talk about the post-mortem interval and how the data has changed since Master Cantu's publication. Talk to us about that.
Migration used to take place close to roads within a mile for obvious reasons. People walking on foot, but they're expecting a ride 10, 20 miles into Arizona. They also tended to stay low in these washes I described earlier that run a little bit downhill out of Mexico towards Phoenix, out of tree coverage, harder to be detected from the air. When Border Patrol did their huge buildup of the Tucson sector in 2010, 2011, they flooded the area with more agents. They made it much harder to cross in the traditional crossing areas. So we think, well, we know, following about 2012 or so, the distance from a road and the elevation of the decedent's death location were higher. Greater distance from a road, higher elevation. So they're up out of the washes and in more remote areas. What that translates to is they're going to be found later than they would have. They're going to be found weeks or months instead of days later. So when everything was kind of tidy and close to the roads, in the washes, if somebody died, the next day perhaps, when the next group of migrants came through that same corridor, somebody would report to somebody, authorities, Border Patrol, that there's a dead body back to the mile. But all that changed certainly by 2014, and it continues to be the 1 or 2 or 3 sun-bleached bones that are being found, and not the bodies.
And this change in the data, as you've described it, does that feed into that concept that the longer a body is out, the more it's going to get scavenged, disarticulated, and dispersed?
Sure.
And related to this issue, do you remember telling the district attorneys, the prosecutors in this case, that there's documentation of 100 cases where limb bone had been linked by DNA to the primary remains separated by 6 miles or more? You were telling them that during your phone
I thought
interview.
I said over 50. It may be close to 100, but I thought I said over 50. We get DNA results back on a monthly basis. In almost every monthly report, we find out that 2 partial assemblages of bones that we thought were 2 people, we had no reason to think that they were 1 person. We now know they're 1 person.
And it sounds like being able to do DNA analysis on remains that are miles and miles apart has impacted your practice and your understanding of these concepts.
Objection, Your Honor.
Your objection being?
It's a leading question, and DNA is outside the scope of the clause.
I think it's the third question. You can answer the question, remember?
Well, we do DNA analysis to try to identify people so we can return their remains to the family. In doing so, we encounter this added bonus, if you will, of discovering that we don't have 2 dead people, we have 1. So it serves to give us a more accurate number of the number of people that have died and been recovered in the Sonoran Desert. But we're doing it to try to do DNA comparisons with family members.
There was some talk about your experience in the Sonoran Desert versus experience of other forensic anthropologists in Colorado Southwest. Remember talking about that?
Yes.
And it was brought up during Cross where the counsel posited that you told Investigator Heidel you would defer to your colleagues who had more experience with this type of environment. Remember talking about that?
I do, but that would have been in the context of PMI, post-mortem interval, and it would not have been in the context of what a coyote can do to a dead person.
And during that same conversation with Investigator Heidel, do you remember following up by saying you would never say that everything you previously talked about was irrelevant and that the only person who could analyze the remains would be a Colorado forensic anthropologist? Do you remember arming them with that statement too?
No.
Would looking at Investigator Heidel's report refresh your recollection as to whether or not you made that statement?
Sure.
Go ahead.
24725. And the way this works, Doctor, is...
Sorry.
No, you're good. Oh. Turn off.
No, we're good. We're good.
And the way this works, Doctor, is you don't read that out loud to the jury. You read that portion of the report and see if it reminds you if you told prosecutors that particular statement in 2019 when you agreed to interview. So I'm going to ask you to read it silently and then let me know if it helps you remember. Does it help you remember?
It does.
Do you recall making that statement that you would never say the only person qualified to look at these remains would be a Colorado anthropologist?
I do.
And that was in the same context as with the first statement, correct?
Your Honor,
Yes,
if it's easier, we could put the paragraph into evidence, let the jury read it.
I'm fine with that if you want to.
I'm not stipulating that.
If I may, what I was referring to about expertise was frozen bodies. And again, this is a, what's the word?
I'm going to ask you not to testify about the integrity of the
Okay.
document.
Let me just say this.
No,
Your Honor.
no, you gotta wait for a question.
I was talking about frozen
Was
bodies.
that your objection?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Was that your objection?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you.
What were you talking about?
Frozen bodies. Very little experience. I can think of 1 body, maybe 2, that were up in the mountains in the wintertime. I was talking about deferring to somebody, a local anthropologist, who saw frozen bodies on a regular basis.
Understanding you've done thousands of death investigations, why were you uncomfortable opining on a sock in a courtroom today?
Well, the prosecutor asked a very precise question, and I didn't give a very precise answer. When he asked, I believe, is an untattered shoe or sock evidence of scavenging, I should have said no. It's evidence, it can be evidence of somebody, in the case of Sonoran Desert, taking off their clothing because they're overheated, then they die, then they're scavenged. So to show me seemingly an untattered sock, although that might have animal puncture tooth punctures in it, I can't tell, and the tennis shoe that looked a bit weathered but intact. For me to say that's evidence of scavenging is not what I should have said. I should have said that could be evidence of people taking their clothing off. That has nothing to do with scavenging, except remove those two items from the body so the coyote would have, or the other animals would have greater access.
And the condition of that shoe and sock, does that change your analysis of the massive coyote scavenging of the skeletal elements in this case?
It has no bearing on the 6 or 7 bones I looked at in this young man.
And I can have one moment.
Yes.
One other item that came up during cross-examination was how when you looked at the zygomatic root, that area on the skull struck you as suspicious. You remember affirming that on
Yes, yes.
And because that struck you as suspicious, is that why you investigated it and looked closely at it?
Well, I think I was looking through my loop, my 8-power loop, at that part of this young man's cranium, and saw something, saw a sulci, saw a natural. I probably didn't pay much attention to the sulci at first because they're expected, especially as I think I mentioned earlier, in the rapidly growing head of a young person. And what was suspicious was this little piece of bone that was kind of hinged up. I couldn't think of anything that could cause that except what I explained earlier about raking something through that sulcus.
And so it sounds like it looked suspicious, and then you looked at it and you drew your conclusion.
Right. Correct.
And that conclusion was that was consistent with animal damage to sulci, correct?
It was certainly consistent, not only consistent with it, but it was in the very near, a centimeter away, the very near vicinity of an area of the cranium that we know by breakage and punctures was broken by a caning.
Nothing further for this witness, Judge.
Any questions from the jury? Okay, we're gonna put up Exhibit 372, and these questions are all pretty much related, so there may be some overlap on them. So, regarding Exhibit 372, and if you need to get down, that's fine, if you need to explain things. Which of the marks, defects, cuts do you believe to be sulca? They weren't sure if you were indicating one or both.
I'm sorry. Ear infection.
No, that's it.
Can I stand?
Please do.
I've got an ear infection, and, okay, this is gonna be good.
Okay. Which of the marks, defects, cuts do you believe to be sulca? They weren't sure which one you're indicating, or if you're indicating both.
This one here, the one that has the about, this one here, I think you should be natural, but, an adulterated out, so.
So do you think they're both sulcus or not?
I think they're both sulci.
Right.
Yes.
Tell them that.
I think they're both sulci.
Okay. And microphone for the rest of this, okay? All right. If the sulcus or sulci are natural, is it well, if they are sulci, is it natural for the sulci to be uneven in length along the way these two are placed?
No, that's an area across the bony skull here where neurovascular bundles break over the bone. So this is one area we expect to find. With the widening face, part of widening the face in adult, zygomatic arches going forward laterally. So one of many places in a growing child where we expect sulci.
So and you would expect them to be different in length then because of where they are on the face?
No.
You think they'd be the same length?
Sorry?
You think they would be the same length?
I guess I'm not getting the question.
All right. The question is it natural for the sulci to be uneven in length, so they're different lengths?
Right. The length is really dependent on the curvature of the bone and the length of the bone and the stretchability. One neurovascular bundle might stretch a bit more than the other, might be smaller diameter. So the irregular appearance of these is to be expected.
Okay. And did you observe any other sulci on the cranium?
I believe there were more. Than this close-up photo shows, as would be expected.
Okay. What other evidence would need to be present to suggest the skull fracture was caused by something other than an animal?
We're referring to the sigmoidal fracture above the left eye?
I believe so.
We would need what we call an impact site, but we don't. It could be the face. But there are no impact sites on the recovered part of the cranium. Nothing that would suggest there was a blow, blunt force blow to this child's head that then caused that cranium. We don't have the face. Those kinds of fractures can occur with blunt force trauma to the face.
Okay. Explain how you can render an expert opinion without using the best technology available in the lab.
It's a good question. The power of my loop, 8 power, is enough for me to think that that's a sulcus. If the question concerns scanning electron microscopy, that could have been done. That would have cleared things up pretty readily. So I think my opinion, at the level of my opinion, I think my eyeball and my magnifying loop are enough to tell me those are sulci.
Okay. Could you put up 371, please?
Yes, sure. It's the same photo, just absolutely.
Without the ears? Okay, I wasn't sure what it was. In your expert opinion, why do the marks look sharp if natural sulci? If natural sulci is rounded?
They don't look sharp to me.
Okay. Do you believe the difference between mountainous and desert regions, i.e. the animal's diets, amount of available food, and terrain, would have an effect on the way the animal would scavenge?
Yeah, I don't have any expertise in that. I could just tell you with Arizona, the range of Arizona coyotes have.
Okay. All right. have a seat for a second. Any follow-up from either side?
I think it's our witness.
Oh, that's right, I'm
So
sorry.
we bat first, Judge.
Thank you.
To the best, regarding and we can take that down if you like. You've talked about your magnification, just got asked about your magnification. Are you aware of any of the prosecution's anthropologists using a scanning electron microscope to look at this?
No.
And you said that on a cranium from someone of this age, you'd expect to find sulci. Why is that? One more time.
The head is probably the most rapidly growing part of our bodies in the early teens, in the pubescent age. So, for whatever reason, I don't know if it's known, bone can grow faster than neurovascular bundles can stretch. So, in an adult, once everything settles down and the bones aren't getting any bigger, the stretching of the neurovascular bundles elicits a response, so the neurovascular bundles loosen up a little bit. That's not the case in a growing child.
And what contributes to the length, width, shape, contours of sulci?
The size of the bundle, so again, a bundle is a vein. It's the artery taking blood to tissue. It's a vein bringing back blood. And it's at least one nerve, a motor nerve we call, that would innervate, would make that muscle twitch if it's a muscle. And then maybe some other sensory nerves coming back from that area. It's all wrapped up in a myelin sheath that's probably on that part of the face, definitely smaller than the diameter of a pencil lead. Much bigger than a hair, much bigger than a human hair, but smaller than a pencil lead. And that can vary depending on the amount of blood supply needed to an area and the amount of nerve supply needed.
And regarding the image on 372, why don't you think those are sharp?
Why did I think those are sharp?
Why do you think they are not sharp?
They look blunt to me. They look, when we talked about the V versus the U, that one looked like it was more U-shaped, more of a sulcus. More, I shouldn't say that, because the U and the V are tooth punctures and sharp implement. The sulcus is a shallow U, right? So to me, it looked more like a shallow U, a depression caused by the bone growing faster than the soft tissue could stretch, and it didn't look sharp.
And in your opinion, would it be an incisor that could rake through those sulci?
I think it's possible.
Nothing further, Judge.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor. Doctor, the scanning electron microscope that you've referenced, that's not required to determine sharp force injury, is it?
You can do it with lesser power. You could do photomicrographs at maybe 50 times, 100 times.
Or a dissection microscope, for example?
A dissection microscope fitted with a camera like we have at our Tucson lab, we can take photomicrographs at 50 to 100 times.
And in fact, SWIGANT, OSAC, and the Academy Sciences Board don't require a scanning electron microscope to determine sharp force injury.
No.
You use the magnifying glass, right?
I use a magnifying loupe, a glass, and a dissection scope of 40 to 100 power.
I'm sorry.
Oh,
You may have misunderstood my question. In this case,
an 8 power loop, 8 times loop.
and the curvature of the vein, I think you just addressed with counsel's question. That's a groove consistent with the sulcus, right?
I believe both. I believe it is.
And a sulcus would not have a V-shaped channel. Am I right?
Unless a sharp implement went through it.
And a V-shaped channel would be consistent with a sharp instrument going through it.
I'll go with the book. I'll go with the standard definition that a sharp knife would produce a V-shaped mark, probably more than a tooth could.
And that's reflected in the fact that a sulcus doesn't have sharp edges, right?
I'm sorry, it doesn't have.
Sharp edges?
Right. It's just a shallow depression.
And to your naked eye and the magnifying loupe that you used, you saw the uplifted edge of the sulcus that you, of the cranium that you looked at in 2019.
That's correct.
And regarding skull fracture, counsel just asked you a couple questions. An impact site would cause fractures to radiate outward from that, right?
It can cause radiating fractures. This is not necessarily a radiating fracture, it's just a perimortem pipe fracture.
But a blunt force trauma strike to the face could result in that kind of fracture.
Hypothetically, yeah, then that would be called a radiating fracture.
Nothing further, thank you.
Anything else from the jury? Can this witness be excused?
Yes, please.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll take our lunch recess. You're free to go if you want. You don't have to stay for this. It's okay. Please remember not to discuss the case among yourselves or with anyone else during this trial. Don't look at anything, don't read about it, don't discuss anything about this case. Don't gather any information on your own, and don't start deliberating until you've heard all the evidence and received the instructions of court and heard the arguments of counsel. There's some stuff that needs to be accomplished over the lunch hour, so we're going to go for an hour and a half, which will be 1:40, and so we'll see you back here at that time. Thank you. Okay, going to be seated. So you're planning on Dr. Hoff next, is that right or not? Okay, then after that, who do you have? We're not going to do Dr. Danielson right after lunch. I have not looked at that. That's going to take some time.
Right.
So Dr. Ha was available, I thought. Okay, and then after that, do we have anybody, or what's going on?
Yes, I mean, I understood, Your Honor, to want to deal with the Ha and Danielson issues, so we're ready to go with Jerry after whenever people want to.
Okay, that's all I wanted to know, that you had other people ready to go. Okay. Okay, with that, we'll be in recess. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Uh-huh.